That's okay with me. Those were the words delivered by US President Donald Trump on November 16th, when he was asked about a proposed US Senate bill that could cause severe damage to Russia's economy. And with those 4 words, the US under Trump has delivered a major message to Russian President Vladimir Putin. It's time to take peace discussions seriously, or the US is going to make Russia pay. How, you might wonder? With a new bill that would impose sanctions unlike any that we've seen before in the war. The US has officially had enough of Russia, and it's just slapped Putin so hard that the handmark can be seen on the Russian president's face from Washington. On November 17th, Euronews reported that American lawmakers are currently working on a bill that would allow the US to impose severe sanctions as a response to Russia's role in the Ukraine war. However, those sanctions won't be levied against Russia itself. They will be secondary sanctions, and they can rise as high as a 500% tariff on any countries that do business with Russia while Putin continues his brutal invasion of Ukraine. This isn't necessarily new news. The senators who are drafting the bill actually proposed this tariff back in May, only to see any suggestion that it could be implemented get shot down as Trump was still trying to work with Putin to negotiate a Ukraine war peace deal. It seems the bill didn't disappear, but was instead placed on the back burner so it could be used when the time was right. That time appears to be now, and the 4 words with which we introduced the video are the reason why. Trump appears to have given his okay for the bill to go beyond the draft status, and that is very bad news for Putin. To understand why, you need to know how a secondary sanction works. With a traditional sanction, an entity targets another entity with financial measures that are supposed to make life more difficult for the second entity. The many sanctions implemented against Russia's businesses and wealthy individuals offer good examples. Usually, the country implementing the sanctions prevents those businesses and individuals from doing business or otherwise operating on the sanctioning nation's territory. The more nations that implement the sanctions, the fewer options the sanctioned entity has for making money. That's the general idea behind a sanction, at least in some cases. A secondary sanction works differently. Rather than directly targeting the entity that it wants to punish, a sanctioning nation instead targets the allies, partners, and buyers who are involved with that country. The idea is that the financial pressure placed on whoever is dealing with the sanctioned entity will be so great that those affected by the secondary sanctions will seek other partners or suppliers. In Russia's case, this might mean that a country like China, which buys Russian oil, gets hit with a 500% tariff that makes it think twice about buying that oil. China then switches suppliers to another nation, avoiding the tariff, and Russia ends up with a multi-billion-dollar hole in its bank balance that it is unable to fill. It's punishment by proxy, and the US is hoping that secondary sanctions can become an effective tool in the battle to bring Putin back to the negotiating table. Back to the bill. Trump followed up his claim that it was okay by him with a statement explaining what he intends for the bill to do. Any country that does business with Russia will be severely sanctioned, Trump claimed before adding, "We may add Iran to that formula." That's an interesting wrinkle. The original bill, which was proposed by Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, only applies to Russia. Trump now seems to be implying that the same bill could be extended to punish Iran. If that's the case, that would mean Trump places his own stamp on a bill that is already proposing a 500% tariff on imports from countries that buy Russian petroleum products or uranium. Those buying similar products from Iran could now be added into the mix. Plus, sanctioning Iran would also give those that the US may want to weaken with this bill beyond Russia, such as China, fewer options when it comes to dealing with their oil needs. There's also a suggestion that another 500% tariff could be applied to general goods and services that come from Russia. We just mentioned that Trump seems to be trying to apply his own stamp to Graham and Blumenthal's bill. He may even be trying to claim full credit. In its report on Trump's potentially giving the okay for new secondary sanctions, Politico reported the US president as saying, "As you know, I suggested it, so any country that does business with Russia will be severely sanctioned." If Graham or Blumenthal are upset by the potential of Trump claiming that their idea was actually his, then neither seems to be showing. Graham in particular seems to be ecstatic the bill now has a chance to move forward. "I'm very pleased with President Trump's blessing. Congress will be moving on the overwhelmingly bipartisan Russian sanctions bill that will provide President Trump with more tools to end the bloodbath in Ukraine," Graham said on X in the wake of Trump seeming to give the bill his blessing. He then added, "This legislation is designed to give President Trump more flexibility and power to push Putin to the peace table by going after both Putin and countries like Iran that support him. I appreciate the strong bipartisan support for this legislation in both the House of Representatives and the Senate." In other words, the Senate has been waiting for this moment. And it's likely going to strike while the iron is hot. Politico points out that the US Senate has been reluctant to act on Graham and Blumenthal's bill earlier because Trump hadn't expressed his support. However, plenty in the Senate have shown their support in other ways. The bill, which has been named the Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025, has more than 80 co-sponsors, which basically amounts to the Senate screaming at Trump that it's ready to move forward with the bill whenever he is. There's just one problem. Though Trump may finally be ready to act, many of Ukraine's allies may not be ready for the upcoming US move. Newsweek highlights this, pointing out the new Sanctions Act could lead to the casting of a large net that will sweep up more than the likes of China and India. There are many countries that are US and Ukraine allies that are still doing business with Russia and may be impacted by the proposed 500% tariffs. Among them are Turkey, Japan, South Korea, Brazil, Singapore, and the entire European Union, or EU, all of which buy Russian petroleum products in various amounts. These countries could be added to a large list that includes the likes of China, Iran, India, Vietnam, Egypt, and many others, effectively making the new sanctions close to a blanket tariff on much of Europe and Asia, as well as parts of Africa and South America. Whether this is fair to America's allies or not is a matter of opinion. It could certainly be argued that the EU is doing almost as much to fund Russia's war effort as it's doing to support Ukraine, even if it's doing so inadvertently. On October 10th, Reuters published a report in which it said that the EU finds itself in the strange position of financing both sides of the conflict, with Russia receiving billions of dollars from the bloc due to its oil and gas purchases. The first 8 months of 2025 alone saw the EU collectively spend 11 billion euros, or about $12.75 billion, on Russian energy. Plus, Reuters adds 7 of the EU's 27 member nations actually increased the value of their energy imports from Russia versus the same period in 2024. Of those 7 nations, 5 are actively supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia. France's imports, for instance, have jumped up in value by 40%, while the Netherlands has spent 72% more on Russian energy than it did during the first 8 months of 2024. Is this a conflict of interest? Perhaps, and the EU seems to know it. On October 24th, the BBC reported that over 20 nations have banded together to take Russian oil and gas off the global market. This is a somewhat nebulous claim, and the BBC doesn't outline which 20-plus nations have made the pledge. However, it does point out that the claim came in the wake of both the US and UK sanctioning 2 of Russia's largest oil companies, while the EU took aim at Russia's liquid natural gas, or LNG. Al Jazeera adds that the EU has moved to ban both pipeline oil and LNG imports from Russia by 2028. However, that's still more than 2 years away. If America's secondary sanctions come into play before 2028, which seems very likely now that Trump has given the okay, then the EU is going to be in for a tough time. The bloc may be able to negotiate with the US to be exempt from the 500% tariffs, but that would also mean that the tariffs aren't as effective as they're supposed to be. The EU may be about to find itself in a tough spot. But it will ultimately be Russia that gets hit the hardest by the new US sanctions, and the Kremlin mouthpieces were already starting to crawl out of the woodwork to make their views heard long before Trump gave the okay to the Senate bill. Or more accurately, make Putin's views heard, because Russia's president is rarely brave or foolish enough to say what he wants to say in the wake of Russia getting slapped by the US. If any of the many commentators still harbored illusions, here you go. Dmitry Medvedev raged when talking about the US sanctioning 2 Russian oil giants. The US is our enemy, and their talkative peacemaker has now fully taken the road to war with Russia. An already crumbling relationship between the US and Russia now seems to be on the verge of collapse. We can only imagine what Russia's response will be to the latest news. If there's one saving grace for Putin, it's that Trump saying he's okay with Graham and Blumenthal's bill doesn't guarantee it will become law. There are 2 barriers that stand in the way, one of them being Trump himself. Euronews implies that the US president saying that he's okay with the bill isn't an automatic guarantee that he will approve it. Trump could just be trying to place more pressure on Putin, with the mere threat of the bill, which would make Trump's words yet another attempt to bring Putin back to the Ukraine war peace negotiating table. Whether the gambit pays off or not, assuming that it's a gambit at all, will depend on Putin's reactions. If Trump feels that Putin still isn't willing to negotiate, a stated okay could become an official okay very soon. There are signs that Trump has already given up on Putin. Back in August, and in the wake of his face-to-face meeting with Putin in Alaska, Trump flat out said that Russia's president may not be willing to make a deal after all. Trump began talking about Ukraine's security situation soon after that meeting, with Reuters reporting him as stating, "When it comes to security, Europeans are willing to put people on the ground. We're willing to help them with things, especially, probably, by air," on an episode of Fox News' Fox and Friends. When asked about Putin's willingness to make a deal, Trump conceded that Putin may not be willing at all, adding, "We're going to find out about President Putin in the next couple of weeks." That couple of weeks has long since passed. However, Trump still seemed to hold out hope that he could have some influence over Putin as recently as October. The US and Russian presidents were supposed to meet for further peace discussions in Hungary during that month, only for the meeting to be cancelled. Why? Trump explained that he had no intention of taking part in a wasted meeting, and that he had no intentions of meeting with Putin in the immediate future. This wasn't a meeting being postponed. It was a meeting that Trump says he cancelled outright because he doesn't believe Putin is serious about peace. Now, less than a month later, the US president is seemingly giving the thumbs up to a bill that all but confirms that he has given up on convincing Putin to strike a deal. Assuming that the Trump barrier has been cleared, the Sanctioning of Russia Act of 2025 still isn't out of the woods. In fact, it's only on the second step of a multi-step approval process that ends with Trump. USA.gov explains that process, noting that for a bill to become law, the bill first needs to be proposed. The proposal can come as a result of a petition by the people, a promise made on a congressional candidate's campaign trail, or, as is the case with Graham and Blumenthal's bill, a draft put forward by a sitting member of the US Senate or House of Representatives. Upon being introduced, the bill is then assigned to a relevant committee, which will conduct research and debate the bill, making any tweaks that it deems necessary. The Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025 is on this step, as it's been referred to the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing and Urban Affairs. There it still sits, with a prognosis of a 2% chance of being enacted, according to the GovTrack website. That prognosis may need an update after Trump's most recent comments. Assuming the bill makes it past this committee, it will then be put before the Senate chamber for a first vote, due to the bill having been proposed by the Senate. If the bill passes, it then goes to the House of Representatives, where it undergoes the same committee and voting process. Then there are two more potential delays, as the two bodies of Congress may have made different amendments to the bill, meaning they have to come together to finalize and vote on a final draft. The voting and drafting processes will be reversed if the bill were proposed in the House, as the House would handle the first round, followed by the Senate, and then on to the joint draft and vote. Only when a bill gets through all of this does it go to the president to sign. And even then, the president has veto power that could lead to him overruling the bill entirely. At least that's the case most of the time. Congress can override a presidential veto if the bill being presented passes by a 2/3 vote or higher in both the House and the Senate. This isn't an easy standard to reach, though the sanctions bill is on the right track due to having more than 80 co-sponsors. What this all means is that the new US bill isn't going to become law immediately, and even if the bill does make it to the desk of Donald Trump, getting it passed into law may be a case of hoping that Trump still feels the same way then as he does now, assuming the conditions for a veto override aren't met. Assuming that all of this happens, the US will have a brand new law on its hands that allows it to implement 500% tariffs against any country that buys Russian petroleum and uranium products. Amendments made during the committee and voting processes may change that, perhaps making the bill even harsher if current speculation is to be believed. But if all goes well, and Trump seems to be suggesting that it will, yet more economic pressure will be piled onto Putin. Trump has already used tariffs to gain leverage and attempt to force through deals with many other countries since he began his second term as president. This bill has the potential to inject a dose of steroids into that tariff-centric policy, at least when it comes to Russia's oil customs. There's only one question left to answer. Will the Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025 actually work? That's where the waters become a little muddy. On the surface, the bill seems very effective. Tariffs are used to place pressure on Russia's oil customers to stop buying. That pressure causes them to do just that, which takes billions of dollars out of Putin's war chest. It's a nice theory, but secondary sanctions aren't a new idea, and there have been instances in the past where they've failed to work. The World Economic Forum, or WEF, said as much back in 2018, noting that there are several issues that can make secondary sanctions ineffective. The scale of the proposed economic losses of nations affected by the sanctions is the foremost reason why secondary sanctions fail. A 500% tariff may be enough to overcome that problem, at least with countries that don't have the financial resilience of a nation like China. The question still has to be asked about whether America's new sanctions will inflict enough financial damage to override the economic benefits of buying Russia's cut-price oil in massive quantities. Such sanctions can also fail because they're directed at policies that the sanctioned nation is unlikely to revoke under any circumstances, the WEF adds. That sounds an awful lot like Putin's position on Ukraine. However, the US secondary sanctions may be different because of the Ukraine war. Trump would prefer for those sanctions to bring Putin back to the negotiating table, but if they don't, and the sanctions stop other countries from buying Russian oil, then that works too. Without Russia's oil money, Putin will seriously struggle to fund his war, which could create the same result as productive peace talks, an end to the Ukraine war. There is also a very real risk that comes from the implementation of secondary sanctions, causing the affected nations to band together against the US. China is already somewhat allied to Russia, though some might argue that it's using Putin's weakened position as leverage. Still, enforcing these sanctions could be tough against the nation that is capable of skirting them, and it brings with it the risk of some of the affected banding together and implementing their own sanctions or tariffs against the US. Despite these challenges, secondary sanctions have worked in the past. DW points this out, noting that the Barack Obama administration used this very tactic, albeit without the massive tariffs, to target banks and other entities that were doing business with Iran. Obama's goal then was to convince Iran that it was time to negotiate about limiting its nuclear program, and the former president's efforts paid off. These are all future problems. Right now, the Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025 has received verbal approval from Trump and nothing more. There's a long way to go before the bill that Graham and Blumenthal proposed becomes US law, and only then will we see the true impact of America's secondary sanctions and 500% tariffs. Trump's suggested approval of secondary sanctions against Russia is far from the only message that the US has sent to Putin in recent days. Last week, a US B-52 bomber humiliated Russia in a powerful show of force during a NATO exercise that took place right on Russia's doorstep. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest moves that the US is making against Putin's regime. And thank you, as always, for watching.